We don't usually think about Canada when we think about America's military past, but the US has invaded Canada numerous times without ever gaining a foothold in the Great White North. And since the countries share the longest land border in the world at 5,525 miles, or 8,891 kilometers, border disputes over the years have nearly become full-blown military events, and some of them were downright weird. You guys know I love when I have an excuse to dig into some fun Canadiana, so let's dive down into this rabbit hole. Hello everyone, I'm Amy, author, historian, and occasional gamer. I've been working in US history for more than a decade now, with a heavy focus on Cold War and space race history. But there are lots of other eras and stories I've always wanted to learn more about. So now I learn about them and share what I learn with you guys, like the history of American-Canadian conflicts. Before we get into it, we need a little primer on the relevant events in Canadian history because it helps to have some benchmark dates of things like when and where the first colonizers set up cities and when Canada gained its independence. Canada's history, much like America's, is steeped in colonization by European powerhouses, in this case England and France. England was the first to plant its flag on territory that is modern-day Canada. In 1497, Italian explorer John Cabot reached Newfoundland and Labrador on behalf of King Henry VII. But Cabot never managed to set up a strong foothold for England. He left that door open for French explorer Jacques Cartier, sailing on behalf of King François. Cartier made 3 trips between 1534 and 1541, traveling down the St. Lawrence River, the major waterway from the Atlantic that leads into Inner Canada. He got as far as the Lachine Rapids, which is close to modern-day Montreal. He reported back to François that the land he found was massive, rich in fish and wildlife, with indigenous people who were willing to trade. As a bit of a sidebar, Cartier is also credited with naming the country. Canadians all grew up with heritage minutes, and this one that tells the story of how, when he first met Iroquois, he misinterpreted the word Kanata, which means village, as referring to the whole region. That was later expanded to the whole country. And it's also worth noting that Cartier's good relations with the Iroquois broke down pretty quickly when his men captured their chiefs and took them to France so they could guide follow-up groups and help establish settler camps. Subsequent expeditions set up small camps along the St. Lawrence in modern-day Quebec, but it was King Henri IV who established the first real European foothold in Canada. Hoping to exploit the financial opportunity, he sponsored explorer Samuel de Champlain to establish a trade route. Champlain led dozens of expeditions in the 1600s before setting up permanent settlements at Port-Royal in the Bay of Fundy and Quebec City. King Louis XIV was the first to prioritize populating the new territory, and New France flourished. But France's alliance with Austria, Russia, and Spain dragged it into the 7 Years' War in 1756. While France was distracted, Britain swooped in. The British already had some presence in Canada on account of its fur trade. The Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company were established around 1700, but now it took over. The fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island fell to the British in 1758. Followed by Quebec City in 1759 and Montreal in 1760. While Britain expanded its influence, many former French colonists felt indifferent or even hostile to their new rulers. In 1791, the British Parliament passed the Constitutional Act that split the Canadian territories into 2 colonies. The Ottawa River served as the natural border between Upper Canada, roughly corresponding to modern-day Ontario, and Lower Canada, roughly corresponding to modern-day Quebec. By then, Britain's hold on the so-called New World was loosening. The 13 colonies in America had fought for and won their independence in the American Revolution that lasted from 1775 to 1783. Britain wasn't sure if the new nation would be friendly or hostile to the Canadian colonies. This is kind of the whole thing in this entire story. Nearly a century passed before Canada established its independence from Britain. The 4 British colonies of Quebec, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and New Brunswick joined together in 1867, 2 years after the American Civil War ended. The new nation was the Dominion of Canada, defined as a self-governing state within the British Empire. Gradually, more colonies joined the fledgling nation. Manitoba and the original Northwestern Territory that included Alberta and Saskatchewan joined in 1870. Alberta and Saskatchewan both became standalone provinces in 1905. Vancouver Island and British Columbia joined the Dominion of Canada as a single province in 1871. Yukon became a distinct province in 1898, with Nunavut splitting off in 1999. In the east, Prince Edward Island joined Canada in 1873. Newfoundland and Labrador remained separate colonies until 1949. And it wasn't until the 1960s that Canada stopped going by its title of Dominion of Canada, though that's still the country's proper name. Okay, now that we have a primer in Canadian history with some key dates and major moments in American history, let's dive into the history of aggression between the two nations. The US colonies hadn't yet declared their independence from Great Britain when they invaded Canada for the first time. The Continental Army set out to seize Quebec City in the summer of 1775, hoping to secure a foothold on the St. Lawrence River and also recruit French Canadians in the fight against the British. Colonel Benedict Arnold led a group of soldiers through the forests of Maine, reaching his target in November. He requested the city surrender, which it didn't. Without enough men to launch an assault, Arnold waited for General Richard Montgomery's men, who were making their way via Lake Champlain in Vermont towards Montreal. The two groups finally merged in December, which was a problem for Arnold. The enlistment period for a lot of his men was expiring on New Year's Day, so he had no choice but to launch a desperate attack on Quebec City using a blizzard as cover on December 31st. It failed spectacularly. The British were ready with artillery and muskets. Montgomery was killed in the first wave, and as subsequent waves failed to penetrate the city, the Continental Army had no choice but to retreat. The men who stayed in Canada waited for reinforcements and supplies, but this also gave the British time to get organized and call up their own reinforcements. In the end, the 1,200 Americans who fought the Battle of Quebec suffered far heavier losses than the British. This Canadian battle was the Americans' first big defeat during the Revolution. As a weird point of interest, Benedict Arnold notoriously switched sides during the Revolution. He was so upset about being passed over for promotions within the Continental Army that he started working as a covert agent for the British. When his treason was discovered, he fled to New York City and accepted a commission in the British Army in 1780. Very weird end to his story. This American-British conflict was rooted in U.S. grievances over British maritime practices during the Napoleonic Wars. British troops were boarding U.S. ships to check cargo heading to France. America requested an end to this practice. Britain said, "Nah, we're going to keep doing it," so the U.S. declared war on Britain. Almost immediately, American leaders started eyeing Canada's maritime access. The idea was to stick it to the British by taking over these important footholds in its largest colonies. And the Americans thought it would be a cakewalk. Former President Thomas Jefferson went so far as to say that the acquisition of Canada will be a mere matter of marching. Americans expected Canadians to rise up and fight their British overlords the same way they had. But a decent number of Canadians at this point were former colonists who had fled the US during the American Revolutionary War. There were also a large number of French Canadians who still felt abandoned by France, and who didn't feel too warm towards America, who was a close ally to their former colonizers. Across the board, Canadians weren't keen on joining America in fighting their own country. But America didn't think about that, or maybe leaders just didn't care. One of the first attacks against Canada was in Detroit. Brigadier General William Hull, charged with protecting the Michigan Territory during the war, tried to secure Canadian land for America. He assembled an army in Ohio and moved slowly but surely toward the Canadian border. But he had neither the element of surprise nor an advantage in numbers. British forces and native allies began blocking Hull's supply line to Ohio, and other Americans marching north in the Niagara region were far too far away to lend support. So Hull, exposed and vulnerable, withdrew to Detroit in August, where a cadre of British soldiers led by Isaac Brock and indigenous warriors led by Shawnee Chief Tecumseh moved against the city. Brock and Tecumseh together were such an intimidating force that, without firing a single shot, Hull admitted defeat and actually gave them the city of Detroit. Some 2,400 citizens, as well as Ohio and Michigan military men, were taken prisoner, and Canadians occupied the Michigan Territory. The fall of Detroit led to a temporary ceasefire that gave both sides time to regroup. In October of 1812, U.S. General Stephen Van Rensselaer crossed the Niagara River toward Queenston Heights in an attempt to secure a foothold on the Niagara Escarpment. More than 1,000 Americans crossed into Upper Canada. They succeeded in circling the British, but Canadians fighting alongside Mohawk, Iroquois, and Delaware warriors kept the Americans at bay long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Americans' initial gain was quickly lost. The next attack on Canada came at dawn on April 27, 1813. 16 American ships under Commodore Isaac Chauncey landed west of the Upper Canada capital of York, modern-day Toronto. The Americans easily defeated the small group of soldiers guarding the fort at York, and British General Sir Roger Hale Sheaffe was so overwhelmed and unprepared that he retreated and left 2 local military officers to negotiate the surrender on his behalf. But first, he made things easier for the Americans. As an act of defiance to prevent the invading forces from looting, Sheaffe ordered that all valuables be destroyed. A new warship, still under construction, was burned. The naval stores were destroyed, and a magazine at the fort set on fire. The stored ammunition and gunpowder exploded, launching heavy rocks and debris through the ranks of the American forces, instantly killing nearly 40 men and wounding more than 200 others. This might have slowed the Americans' progress, but they still looted any deserted houses they found and burned public buildings, including Parliament and Government House, and they destroyed the local printing press. Losing the capital exposed holes in British defenses and was, more than anything, an embarrassing defeat. The city remained so poorly defended that Chauncey came back months later and no one stopped him from taking more supplies and burning more buildings. For the Americans, it was a political victory that boosted morale, but the British weren't going to let the story end there. The Canadian Governor-in-Chief, Sir George Prevost, told his men to retaliate so the Americans would never try something like that again. They appropriately set their sights on the U.S. capital of Washington, an inland town that wasn't well protected in a naval-based war. 4,500 British troops sailed up the Patuxent River and landed near Benedict, Maryland on August 18th. The biggest hurdles on their march to the capital were heat and humidity. When they arrived, most American troops, as well as President James Madison, had fled the city. First Lady Dolly Madison, meanwhile, cleverly grabbed cabinet records and a slew of White House items before she left, which turned out to be a very good thing. The British reportedly finished the president's abandoned dinner before burning the White House, the Capitol building, the Library of Congress, the Treasury building, and the Navy Yard. They also managed to free a number of slaves, giving them passage back to Canada. Slavery had been abolished in all British colonies in 1834. The aggressive move obviously drew criticism from Americans, but also from leaders in Europe. Canadians, however, maintained that it was payback for the damage to York, and weirdly, I learned writing this video, it's still a somewhat awkward point of Canadian pride, because of course Canadians still kind of feel bad about it. 2 months later, on October 25, 1813, American General Wade Hampton led troops across the Chateauguay River near Montreal in what was meant to be a coordinated attack with General James Wilkinson, whose men were approaching from the west. Things didn't go smoothly. Hampton's hired guide got his men lost in the woods, and hundreds of them flat out refused to cross the border. Those who did arrive in Lower Canada were met by an all-Canadian group who outsmarted the larger American forces. The Canadians hid behind defenses, shouting, cheering, and blowing into bugles with such intensity that Hampton couldn't figure out how many of them there actually were. He struggled to guide his troops in what became a battle that had losses on both sides, but the Canadians ultimately won and forced Hampton to retreat. Wilkinson's men found their own battle on November 11th. While traveling down the St. Lawrence, they were hounded by British troops, Canadian Voltigeurs, and Tyendinaga Mohawks. The Americans set up camp between Morrisburg and Cornwall on the land of John Chrysler, a wealthy loyalist and captain in the Dundas militia. From there, the Americans tried, but failed to cross the field into Canada. The Battle of Chrysler's Farm was the Americans' last failed attempt to take Montreal during the War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent that ended the war included provisions for Britain to return all occupied territories. That included Detroit. Detroit was occupied by British and Canadians for 14 months. The Patriot War of 1838 is a bit of a stretch to add to our list because it's a Canadian battle that included some Americans, but we'll talk about it quickly. In the 1820s, there was increasing tension between middle-class francophones and the rapidly growing anglophone merchant base in Lower Canada. The French-Canadian nationalists, led by Louis-Joseph Papineau, wanted to get out from under the thumb of British rule. Formalizing this position, Papineau formed the Parti Canadien, which morphed into the Patriot Party in 1826. Economic struggles and an influx of British immigrants in the 1830s increased tensions between French and English Canadians, ultimately leading Papineau to draft his 92 resolutions, a list of political demands sent to London on behalf of his party. Among them was the demand for increased self-government in Lower Canada. Britain's response to the 92 resolutions, which took 3 years to arrive, made things worse. British Parliament didn't want an autonomous colony, so rejected the Patriots' demands. The Patriots responded by boycotting British goods and staging protests that quickly gave way to full-blown rebellions. When the government stopped these violent outbursts, some Patriots fled to the United States, Papineau among them. Stateside, Papineau managed to recruit American sympathizers, and the new secret society became known as Hunter's Lodge. In November of 1838, 300 Hunter Patriots crossed the St. Lawrence River on a path to invade Montreal. The ensuing battle at Windmill saw U.S. Army regulars and the U.S. Navy support British infantrymen and Loyalist Canadian militiamen, actions that both sides saw as treasonous. A few weeks later, a second group of 140 Hunter Patriots crossed the Detroit River in a failed attack on the city of Windsor. The rebels ultimately disbanded, and Papineau fled to Paris. Border disputes were a persistent issue for Canadian-American relations in the 1800s. One of the disputed borders was between the state of Maine and the province of New Brunswick, specifically around the Aroostook River. There wasn't a clear border, and both sides claimed the same swath of land. On December 29, 1838, Americans spotted Canadian lumberjacks felling trees they claimed were American property. 2 days later, the lumberjacks drew arms against each other. The standoff only ended because a bear attacked the Canadians. But the dispute wasn't over. Maine was fed up with the ongoing arguments over who owned the forest and authorized a volunteer militia to go to the border and confiscate any equipment of New Brunswick lumberjacks cutting their trees. The Canadians responded in kind, capturing Americans and transporting them, in chains, to a barracks in the nearby town of Woodstock. The situation escalated. The U.S. sent another 1,000 volunteers to protect the forest, while Canada got British reinforcements from the Caribbean and local Mohawks. U.S. Congress ultimately put 50,000 men and $10 million in military support under the direction of General Winfield Scott to settle the dispute. But before the skirmish could devolve into a full-blown war, and again, before a single shot was fired, U.S. Secretary of State Daniel Webster and British diplomat and Chancellor of the Exchequer Alexander Baring, the first Baron Ashburton, agreed to redraw the border. Ashburton, who maintained the whole territory was worthless, happily ceded some Canadian land to America. The war was called the Pork and Beans War because that was the dinner of choice of lumberjacks in the area, and there was only one death: American Private Hiram T. Smith. No one knows how he died, though. He either froze, drowned, was run over by a supply wagon, or was trampled by a horse. In any case, there's a commemorative marker for the fallen soldier along Route 2A in Haynesville, Maine. American farmer Lyman Cutler was working on his farm on San Juan Island on June 15, 1859, when he saw a large black pig sniffing around his garden and eating his potatoes. So he did what most farmers would. He chased the pig away before shooting it and ultimately killing the animal. But it turned out the pig wasn't a wild boar. It belonged to Charles Griffin, manager of a local ranch owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, the long-standing and still-standing British trading company that had a significant presence in Western Canada. Griffin claimed Cutler was liable for his lost pig, but the issue soon turned from compensation to a land dispute. The island, which sits off the coast of Washington but closer to Vancouver Island, was disputed territory. British authorities threatened to arrest Lyman Cutler and evict him along with 17 fellow American farmers from the island. The U.S. responded by landing 66 soldiers on San Juan and anchoring the warship USS Massachusetts off the coast, cannons at the ready. This prompted the British to anchor 3 of its own warships in Griffin Bay to prevent a U.S. occupation. Both sides increased their presence until there were 500 Americans with 14 artillery cannons on the island, facing down 2,000 British soldiers backed by 5 warships and 70 cannons. Seeing Canada's clear military advantage, the governor of Vancouver Island had the British troops engage with the Americans. Both sides finally agreed to scale back their forces and entered into a holding pattern. The two countries jointly occupied the island, with 100 men on each side, and they lived amicably enough until the dispute was finally settled. In 1872. That's more than a decade later. An arbitration commission appointed by Kaiser Wilhelm I ruled that the land and all the islands in the area belonged to America. The British withdrew their men that year, the Americans following 2 years later. The lone casualty was the pig that started the whole conflict. This next set of conflicts comes after the American Civil War and right around the time of Canada's independence. These are both significant. Canada, up until 1867, could rely on British forces for defense, but at this volatile point in America's history, Britain was a little warier of protecting its colony. Not to mention, Britain had some things going on at home. Coincident with the end of the U.S. Civil War, Britain crushed an Irish-based independence movement. This drew the ire of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Britain, as well as its American iteration, the Fenian Brotherhood, a society made up largely of Irish-American veterans. Collectively known as the Fenians, these Irish nationalists hatched a plan to invade Canada and hold the land hostage in a long-distance attempt to force Britain into giving Ireland its independence. The grassroots group swelled to around 10,000 men, armed with Civil War weapons and experience. The first attack on Canada came on June 1st of 1866, when 1,000 Fenians crossed the Niagara River from Buffalo under former U.S. cavalry officer John O'Neill. They managed to capture Fort Erie before arresting the town council and customs agents. Then they cut off all outgoing telegraph lines and seized tools and horses to start their march along the Welland Canal. But they were met by a resisting force of 22,000 militia volunteers. Sides clashed at Dunnville en route to Chippewa and Port Colborne, and though the Canadians picked the best locations for defense, they weren't well prepared. Their training was seriously lacking. They didn't have field kitchens, and some men didn't even have canteens for water. The first battle was so chaotic that O'Neill ended up withdrawing his men back to America. A week later, 200 Fenians crossed the border near Huntington, just south of Montreal, but they turned back when they came face to face with advancing Canadian and British troops. The Fenians made their first attack on the newly independent Dominion of Canada on May 25th and 27th, 1870. John O'Neill again led 600 Fenians into Canada, but even without British support, the government was able to call 13,000 volunteers to defend the borders of Ontario and Quebec. O'Neill opted for a different approach in October of 1871. He sought support for the Fenian cause from Louis Riel, a founding figure in Manitoba, and the Métis, an Indigenous group of Canadians of mixed European and Indigenous descent living primarily in Western Canada. O'Neill and 40 men entered Manitoba at Emerson and went peacefully to the customs office to ask for an audience with Riel. But Riel wasn't sympathetic to the Fenian cause. Quite the opposite. He called up volunteer soldiers from Winnipeg and St. Boniface. Within a day, O'Neill was forced to admit defeat and retreat from Canada for the third and final time. This is another one on the list that wasn't exactly a planned invasion, but it is an important event in Canadian history and is a battle between Americans and Canadians. So let's talk a little bit about Canada's Wild West. In the highlands of current-day Saskatchewan are the Cyprus Hills, a densely wooded area with accessible water that have been home to First Nations for ages. In May of 1873, the Assiniboine had a village in the hills of about 50 lodges, but they weren't alone. The area was also home to a fair number of Métis, as well as American traders from Montana, specifically 2 groups, one led by Abel Farewell and one by Moses Solomon. Relations were already rocky between the First Nations groups and the American traders when a new source of stress arrived in the form of angry wolf hunters from Fort Benton in Montana. The wolfers had lost several horses and, after tracing their property into Canada, arrived at Farewell's post hopping mad. There's no definitive account of what happened next, but it went something like this. A trader's horse went missing and he blamed the Assiniboine. Wanting a horse, he got the Benton hunters to help him enter the Assiniboine camp and take one, apparently while intoxicated. Women and children fled, while some natives challenged the vastly better armed traders to a fight. The traders ultimately overwhelmed the Assiniboine, killing at least 20, including some women and children. The only casualty on the traders' side was a French-Canadian wolfer named Ed LaGrace. The surviving Assiniboine managed to find safety with the Métis, while the traders returned south, escorted by the Benton wolfers. The massacre was directly responsible for establishing the Northwest Mounted Police, mounted guards hoping to keep the peace in Western Canada, and the Canadian government tried to bring the murderers to justice but failed. Even when Mounties did manage to find and capture 3 of the traitors on Canadian soil, they couldn't try them. No one would testify under oath as to who was involved and what exactly had happened. The charges were ultimately dropped in 1882. Alright, this is an interesting pair of events, and it starts with Buster Brown, not the guy from the cartoons or the children's shoes, the Canadian soldier who made one of the stranger contributions to Canadian military history with Defense Scheme Number 1. James Sutherland Buster Brown was a lifelong soldier. He joined the militia in 1896 at the age of 15, then transferred to the Royal Canadian Regiment in 1906. He served overseas in Britain during the First World War, then at home until his retirement until 1933. He was, throughout his service, deeply suspicious of the United States and extremely proud of Canada's British heritage. This all led him to believe it wasn't impossible for the United States to invade Canada in some future global conflict. And so, in 1921, he started working on a plan to preempt and withstand such an attack. Historians have described Defense Scheme Number 1 as almost Buster Keaton-esque in its genesis. In coming up with his plan, Brown put on a fake fully waxed Victorian mustache and piled into a Ford Model T with 4 similarly disguised officers for a reconnaissance mission along the Canadian-New England border. They took pictures of every lock, bridge, and highway, taking notes in a journal as they went. The notes are really weird. In Burlington, Vermont, Brown wrote that the people seem, quote, very affable and not as American as other cities one has visited. In rural Vermont, he pondered that maybe Americans aren't lazy. Maybe they just, quote, have a very deliberate way of working and apparently believe in frequent rests and gossip. As for the women in rural areas, he wrote that they, quote, appear to be a heavy and not very comely lot. With this peculiar view of Americans in mind, Brown's plan was to use soldiers and air support to occupy Seattle, Spokane, Butte, and Portland in the west, Fargo, Great Falls, and eventually Minneapolis and St. Paul, Niagara, and Detroit in the Midwest, Albany in the east, and Maine in the Maritimes. The idea was that even with a smaller military, Canada would be able to make inroads along the border where there were fewer American defenses, at least keeping the U.S. Army at bay long enough for British support to arrive. Brown pitched his plan to Canadian military leaders with mixed results. World War I veteran and Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, George Parks, thought the plan was a, quote, fantastic, desperate plan that might have a chance. Others thought it was insane. Brown's immediate successor when he retired from the Army, Andrew McNaughton, ordered all copies of the scheme, as well as Brown's recon notes from the mustachioed trip to Vermont, burned. Without knowing about Defense Scheme Number 1, American military planners started drawing up an almost mirror image plan for an invasion of Canada just a few years later. The thinking here was that Britain would eventually challenge its former colony as America became a dominant world power in the wake of the First World War. Not to mention, Britain owed the US about $4 billion in wartime loans. There was fear that British jealousy over America's rising supremacy would spark a war, and that Britain would use Canada as a staging area. U.S. officials anticipated the attacks would start with America's merchant marine and foreign trade. From there, an invasion of the Great Lakes before moving south to Washington, D.C., New York, and Pittsburgh. To stave off these invading forces, War Plan Red called for a naval takeover of Halifax, Nova Scotia, destroying the port city's potential as a rallying point for British forces. Meanwhile, soldiers would advance north from Albany and Vermont to take Montreal and Quebec. From Detroit, soldiers would take Toronto. From Buffalo, they would take Niagara Falls, a main source of electricity. Soldiers from Grand Forks, North Dakota, would take Winnipeg, and rounding out the invasion would be troops from Bellingham, Washington, seizing Vancouver. There was also talk of using chemical weapons and airplanes to bomb centers of industry, two suggestions that came from Charles Lindbergh. Where Canadian leaders thought Brown's Defense Scheme No. 1 was insane, American leaders were quick to see the value of War Plan Red, so much so that in 1935, Congress approved $57 million to update the plan and also build 3 military airfields disguised as civilian airports on the Canadian border. What made all that especially weird was that 3 years after authorizing the updated version of the plan, President Franklin Roosevelt accepted an honorary degree at Queen's University and said in his speech, quote, "I give to you assurance that the people of the United States will not stand idly by if domination of Canadian soil is threatened by any other empire." Obviously, neither plan was ever put into action, and the border between the US and Canada has been calm for more than a century. The idea of a North American Union has also been around since the end of the Second World War, not to mention a strong level of military and economic integration and cooperation between nations. Americans like to make fun of Canada and Canadians all the time, but the peaceful border is actually really important for both countries. That is going to do it for me for today. Thank you guys for spending a little bit of time with me, and I hope I gave you some weird tidbits to pull out at your next awkward social gathering. Friendly reminder that I do stream on Twitch. It's very casual. We chat about all kinds of things from research stuff to life stuff while I play some retro video games, but it's a great time, so come say hi. I need to give a special shout out to all of my Patreon supporters who make all the difference. Being a content creator is brutally hard, and having support from you guys is so important in helping me research and make videos. So thank you so much. Have a fantastic rest of your days, guys, and I'll see you next time.